It began without warning, the way every great catastrophe in human history has always begun. A quiet morning. A sky that looked the way skies are supposed to look. People drinking coffee, scrolling through feeds, watching the news cycle replay another staged rescue from another smiling hero in another perfectly lit segment. The world was, as always, asleep inside its own illusion. And then the illusion cracked. It started in orbit. Satellites blinked out in clusters, dropping off grids one after another like candles snuffed by an invisible hand. Communication networks stuttered. Military installations watched their screens fill with static. In bunkers buried beneath mountains, men in uniforms stared at monitors that no longer obeyed them. Something was descending, something massive, something that did not appear on any radar designed by human minds. Objects began falling from the upper atmosphere, burning fragments of dead satellites, pieces of forgotten machinery. They rained across continents like the bones of an old world being shaken loose. And above them, far above, the sky itself began to darken in a slow, deliberate spiral, as if the heavens were folding inward to make room for something that did not belong. Then he appeared. A single figure, black-armored, silent, descending through the clouds with the calm certainty of a man arriving at a place he had already conquered in his mind. The cape behind him moved without wind. The glow of re-entry faded from his shoulders as if heat itself had bowed to him. His eyes swept across the curve of the planet, measuring it, weighing it, judging it. General Zod had arrived. He hovered above a city of glass towers and digital billboards, a city that called itself the heart of the modern world. He expected armies. He expected fleets. He expected the proud roar of a civilization defending its sovereignty. Instead, he heard music. Laughter from a crowd watching a staged battle between two costumed figures on a stage built for cameras. He saw billboards the size of mountains, each one displaying a different smiling face, each face selling something. Identity. Godhood packaged and prized. To Zod, it was not a civilization. It was a marketplace pretending to be an empire. He drifted lower, slow and unhurried, the way a king walks through a ruin. Below him, people pointed upward. Phones rose like 1,000 small mirrors trying to capture a man who could not be captured. They did not run. They did not kneel. They filmed. They commented. They argued in real time whether he was a publicity stunt, a new hero, a marketing rollout from some studio preparing a summer release. And in a glass tower not far away, behind windows that overlooked the entire skyline, the men and women of Vought International watched in stunned silence. Analysts scrambled. Executives shouted. Screens lit up with hurried briefings. Who is he? Where did he come from? Who owns him? Who signed him? Who approved? The questions tumbled over each other because none of them could imagine a being arriving on Earth without a contract attached. In the highest office of that tower, a man with golden hair and ice in his veins stepped slowly toward the window. Homelander tilted his head. He studied the descending figure with the careful focus of a predator that has just realized it is no longer alone at the top of the food chain. His jaw tightened. His smile, the one he wore for cameras and crowds and frightened employees, was nowhere to be found. Out in the streets, anchors broke into emergency broadcasts. New hero. Possible alien. Possible threat. Possible opportunity. The world, in its infinite hunger for spectacle, did what it always did. It tried to fit the impossible into a story it already understood. But Zod was not a story. He was not a hero. He was not a villain in the small, marketable sense that this world had grown used to. He was something older, something the people below had never truly seen, because their false gods had spent years convincing them that gods look like brand ambassadors. He landed at last in the heart of a public plaza, his boots touching pavement with a weight the ground itself seemed to feel. The crowd fell silent, cameras zoomed, drones hovered. And General Zod, conqueror of worlds, looked upon the people of Earth and felt something he had not expected to feel. Pity. For 3 days, Zod did not speak. He moved through the cities of Earth the way a scholar moves through a museum of failed civilizations, observing, cataloging, understanding. He watched without comment, and his silence was louder than any speech a man could give. The world filled that silence with noise of its own, because that was the only thing the world knew how to do. He stood on rooftops and watched rescues that were not rescues. Fire set by hired men, extinguished by smiling heroes who arrived precisely on cue. Hostages who were actors, villains who were paid. He saw the choreography of it, the way every gesture had been rehearsed, the way the cameras always found the right angle, the way the applause had been engineered before the danger had even begun. He drifted unseen above charity galas where men in tailored suits wrote checks to causes their own companies had created. He watched press conferences where heroes spoke in scripted sentences about courage and duty, their eyes flickering toward teleprompters, their smiles measured in market shares. He listened to children in classrooms recite the names of these heroes the way older generations had once recited prayers. And in every observation the same conclusion deepened inside him. These beings possessed power, real power, enough to lift mountains, to outrun bullets, to burn through steel, and they used it to sell breakfast cereal. To Zod, this was not weakness. Weakness, he understood. Weakness could be forged into strength, given time and discipline. What he saw on Earth was something far worse. It was power without purpose. It was strength surrendered to vanity. It was the sacred reduced to a transaction. On the fourth day, Vought made its move. A sleek black helicopter approached the rooftop where Zod stood watching the skyline at dusk. A woman emerged, flanked by lawyers and handlers, her smile practiced, her posture engineered. She introduced herself with titles that meant nothing to him. She spoke of partnership, of mutual benefit, of the opportunities a being of his caliber could enjoy under proper representation. She mentioned percentages, endorsements, a guaranteed slot among the most powerful figures on the planet. Zod did not interrupt her. He let her finish. He believed in giving even the smallest creatures the dignity of completing their final sentence. When she was done, he turned to face her fully for the first time. His eyes did not glow. His voice did not rise. He simply looked at her the way a general looks at a merchant who has wandered onto a battlefield by mistake. He told her he did not negotiate with shopkeepers who dressed their slaves as kings. He told her that her empire was a costume, that her gods were puppet, that her world had forgotten what authority actually meant. And then he stepped past her, off the edge of the building, and rose into the darkening sky without another word. The woman stood frozen on the rooftop, her practiced smile finally broken. Inside Vought Tower, the footage played on every screen. Executives shouted over each other. Lawyers drafted statements. Publicists tried to spin rejection into mystery. But in the penthouse above them all, one man watched the loop in silence, again and again, his fists slowly tightening at his sides. Homelander had spent his entire life being told he was the strongest being on Earth. He had been engineered for it, conditioned for it, worshipped for it. And now a stranger had landed on his world, refused his masters, dismissed his hierarchy, and not once had this stranger even spoken his name. That, more than anything, was unbearable. He watched the footage again. The calm posture, the unbothered tone, the way Zod had not even glanced at the cameras. There was no performance in him, no need, no hunger for the lens. Homelander understood in that moment what truly terrified him. He had built his entire identity on being adored, on being seen, on the warmth of millions of strangers chanting his name. And here was a man who needed none of it. A man who, by simply existing, made Homelander feel, for the first time in his manufactured life, painfully and undeniably small. The meeting was inevitable. Homelander arranged it the way he arranged everything, with cameras, with crowds, with a stage built to favor his image. He chose a public square in the heart of the city, mid-afternoon, sunlight angled to catch the gold in his hair. Reporters were positioned. Drones were deployed. Vought publicists had already drafted 3 different headlines, each one assuming a different outcome, none of them assuming the one that came. Zod arrived alone. He did not descend dramatically. He did not announce himself. He simply walked into the square from a side street, as if he had been there all along, as if the entire spectacle had been waiting for him to give it permission to begin. The crowd parted around him without being asked. Even the air seemed to step aside. Homelander floated down from above, arms wide, smile wide, the practiced descent of a man who had perfected the art of being watched. He landed a few paces from Zod, and for a moment the 2 strongest beings on the planet stood facing each other in silence while the world held its breath. Homelander spoke first. He always spoke first. He extended a hand, made a joke about jurisdiction, offered a welcome to Earth in the warm tone he reserved for interviews. He talked about responsibility, about shared values, about the importance of cooperation between great men. His words were polished. His teeth were perfect. His eyes searched Zod's face for the reaction every other being on this planet had always given him. He found nothing. Zod did not return the smile. He did not take the hand. He did not even blink. He looked at Homelander the way one looks at a statue someone has dressed in expensive clothes. Without contempt, without admiration, with the simple, devastating neutrality of a man who had already finished evaluating what stood before him. Then he spoke. He asked Homelander a single question, quietly, almost gently. He asked who had given him his name, not chosen it, given it. He asked who had taught him to smile that way, who had written the words he used in interviews, who owned the suit he wore, who decided which crimes he was allowed to stop and which ones he was instructed to ignore. Homelander's smile faltered just for an instant. He recovered quickly, of course. He laughed. He made another joke. He turned to the cameras as if to share the absurdity with his audience. But the audience was not laughing. The audience was watching him the way they had never watched him before. Watching, not adoring. Zod continued, still quiet, still calm. He told Homelander that a true ruler is not crowned by approval ratings. That power measured in applause is power loaned, not power held. That a being who needs an audience to feel real is not a god, but a performer wearing the costume of one. Homelander's hands began to tremble, not from fear, from something far worse, from recognition. He tried to retaliate. He raised his voice. He stepped closer. He summoned a threat that had always silenced every room he had ever walked into. His eyes glowed faintly, a warning the entire world understood. And Zod, without raising his voice, without raising his hand, simply stepped forward to meet him. There was no fight. Not yet. There was only the smallest motion. Zod placed 2 fingers against Homelander's chest, exactly above his heart, and held them there. Not pressing, not pushing, simply present. A reminder of physics. A reminder of hierarchy. A reminder that strength is not measured by what one displays, but by what one chooses not to do. Homelander could not move. For 3 long seconds, in front of every camera, in front of every screen on Earth, the strongest hero on the planet stood frozen with 2 fingers against his chest, his expression slowly cracking into something the public had never been allowed to see. Doubt. Zod lowered his hand. He turned. He walked away. And inside Vought Tower, in a conference room that had gone completely silent, an executive whispered the sentence that would haunt them all. This man is not a hero. He is a ruler. He did not give a press conference. He gave a sermon. It happened at dawn, broadcast across every signal on Earth without permission and without resistance. No network had agreed to it. No satellite had been asked. Every screen in every city, every phone in every hand, every television in every home simply tuned itself to the same image. Zod, standing alone on a high terrace, the rising sun behind him, his cape unmoving, his face calm. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He told the world that he had come from a planet that had perished because its leaders had lied to its people. That his world had drowned in corruption and committees and cowardice dressed as compromise. He told them that he had watched his civilization die because no one had been willing to hold it together with the firmness it required. He told them he had vowed never to allow that failure to happen again. Then he turned his gaze, through the lens, toward every viewer on Earth. He told them that what he had found on this planet was worse than what had destroyed his own. He told them that their gods were salesmen, that their heroes were employees, that their freedom was a marketing slogan written by men who owned the buildings they pretended to protect them from. He told them they had been farmed, harvested for attention, bred for consumption, and that the beings they cheered for were not their protectors but their handlers. He offered them another path. No corporate heroes, no staged rescues, no false saviors selling courage by the bottle. A world where strength served purpose, where order replaced theater, where humanity was led not by the loudest voice in a boardroom, but by the steadiest hand on the wheel. He did not promise paradise. He promised something harder. He promised truth. Then the broadcast ended. The reaction came in waves. In the first hour, the world laughed nervously. In the second, it argued. By the third, something began to shift. In cities where corruption had long since calcified, people began to gather in the streets, not in rage but in something quieter. Hope perhaps, or exhaustion finally finding a voice. Workers walked out of Vought-owned facilities. Soldiers in distant garrisons quietly removed corporate insignias from their uniforms. Mayors of small towns released statements that did not condemn him. In other places, fear took root. Politicians warned of dictatorship. Pundits invoked every tyrant in human history. Religious leaders called him false. Editorials demanded action. Generals in private rooms drew up contingencies. And in the highest offices of every great power, men and women who had spent decades believing themselves untouchable felt, for the first time in a long time, the cold weight of accountability. Vought moved fastest. They labeled him a global threat within the hour. They commissioned attack ads. They funded protests against him in 3 different countries before lunch. They pressured every government still in their pocket to issue condemnations. They scheduled emergency interviews for Homelander, who did not appear at any of them, because Homelander had locked himself in his penthouse and had not spoken to anyone in 19 hours. In a dim warehouse on the edge of the city, a different group watched the broadcast for the 5th time. Butcher sat in front of the monitor with a beer in his hand that he had forgotten to drink. The others stood behind him, silent. They had spent years fighting Vought. Years dismantling the lie of the Supe's one careful, brutal step at a time. They had built their lives on the certainty that Homelander was the worst thing this world would ever have to face. And now they were watching something far more dangerous than Homelander. They were watching a man who actually knew how to rule. Butcher finally set the beer down. He rubbed his jaw. He stared at the frozen image of Zod on the screen, that calm face, that steady gaze, that complete absence of vanity. And he said the thing none of them wanted to hear. Homelander wants to be worshipped, he said. This one wants to be obeyed. And the difference, mates, is that obedience actually works. The room went quiet, because they all understood in that moment what they were truly up against. Not a monster, not a madman, not another corporate puppet wearing a cape. And visions, unlike monsters, do not die when you shoot them. They spread, they take root, they survive the men who carry them. The war, they realized, had already begun. They were simply the last to notice. Vought declared war the way Vought did everything, with a press release. It was framed, of course, as a defense of humanity, a coalition response, a coordinated effort between the 7, the United States military, and a hastily assembled alliance of allied nations who had been promised exclusive merchandising rights to the victory. The campaign had a name. It had a logo. It had a hashtag trending before the first soldier had even loaded his weapon. Zod was given 1 hour to surrender. He did not respond. He did not need to. He simply walked into the center of the city, alone, and waited. The 7 came first. They descended from the sky in formation, exactly the way they had been trained to descend, exactly the way the cameras had been positioned to capture. Homelander led them, his cape catching the wind, his jaw set in the expression his publicists had once described as righteous fury. Behind him came the others, each one a manufactured marvel, each one a brand more than a being. They surrounded Zod in the plaza. The same plaza where days earlier he had landed without resistance. The crowds had been cleared. The drones were everywhere. Every angle had been planned. Every soundbite had been pre-approved. The world watched, breath held, as the strongest beings on Earth converged on the man who had insulted their order. Zod looked at them the way a wolf looks at a circle of painted dogs. The first attack came from above. A blur of speed, a streak of light, the fastest member of the 7 moving at velocities that should have torn the air itself apart. Zod caught him by the throat in midair, without turning his head, without seeming to move at all. He held him there for a moment, examined him the way one examines a poorly made tool, and then released him into the side of a building with a flick of his wrist. The wall folded inward like wet paper. The next came in pairs, then in threes, then all at once. Zod moved through them with a precision that did not look like fighting. It looked like correction. Every motion was minimal. Every strike was final. There was no roaring, no posturing, no witty exchanges for the cameras. He did not perform. He worked. A blast of energy struck him in the chest. He absorbed it without flinching, then returned it tenfold. A figure of impossible strength charged him from behind. He stepped aside and let momentum do the work, sending the attacker through 3 city blocks in a single uninterrupted line. One by one, the icons of the 7, the faces on the billboards, the smiles on the lunchboxes were broken, scattered, silenced. The military arrived in the second hour. Tanks rolled into the streets. Jets screamed overhead. Missiles launched from distant ships, each one carrying enough force to level a district. Zod met them in the sky. He turned aircraft aside with gestures. He caught missiles in his hands and crushed them like fruit. He did not destroy the soldiers. He did not need to. He destroyed only their weapons and watched as men who had been told they were defending the world realized, one by one, that they had been sent to defend a corporation. By the third hour, only one figure remained in the air. Homelander hovered above the ruined plaza, his uniform torn, his cape singed, his face streaked with something he had never worn in public before. Real sweat. The kind that comes not from exertion but from fear. He did not fight for the world. He did not fight for the people below. He did not fight for Vought or the 7 or the country whose flag he wore on his chest. He fought in that final hour for the only thing he had ever truly believed in. His own reflection. He came at Zod with everything he had, every ounce of speed, every burst of heat, every scream that had been bottled inside him since the day he had been born in a laboratory and told he was a god. He hit Zod with the force of a falling sky. He hit him again, and again, and again. Zod let him. For nearly a minute he simply absorbed it, standing in the rubble, allowing the strongest hero on Earth to exhaust himself against a man who could not be moved. And when Homelander finally faltered, when his arms finally shook, when the cameras finally caught the moment his certainty cracked, Zod struck once. Only once. The blow did not kill him. Zod did not kill performers. The blow simply ended him. It drove him down through the plaza, through the pavement, through the layers of the city beneath, until he came to rest in a crater of his own making, conscious, breathing, and broken in a way no surgery would ever repair. The world saw it. The strongest hero on Earth, lying in a hole weeping, and the illusion finally died. The silence that followed the battle was not the silence of fear. It was something stranger. It was the silence of a world waiting to be told what it was now. Governments did not issue statements. They had nothing left to say. Vought did not release a press conference. Vought, for the first time in its long and gilded history, had no script prepared. The 7 were gone. Some captured. Some hiding in places they had once mocked as beneath them. The towers that had defined the skyline of an empire stood empty, their logos still glowing, their elevators still running, their boardrooms abandoned mid-sentence. And in the ruins of the plaza, Zod stood alone. He could have taken it all in that moment. The camera still worked. The network still broadcast. A single command from him delivered in that calm and unhurried voice would have been obeyed by entire nations within the hour. Soldiers were already laying down weapons. Officials were already drafting letters of allegiance. Crowds in distant cities were already chanting his name, not in worship, but in the exhausted relief of people who had finally found something larger than the lie they had been living under. The throne was open. The world was his. And for the first time since he had descended through Earth's atmosphere, General Zod hesitated. He walked slowly through the broken streets. He passed shattered billboards. He passed over overturned vehicles. He passed a child sitting on a curb, watching him with eyes that held no fear, only curiosity. He stopped. He looked at the child for a long moment. The child did not look away. He continued walking. He passed a woman kneeling beside an injured man, pressing a torn jacket against a wound. She did not look up at him. She did not have the time. He passed an old man sweeping glass from the doorway of a small shop, muttering quietly to himself, already rebuilding before the dust had settled. He passed 2 strangers helping a third to her feet, none of them speaking, all of them moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had decided, without being told, what needed to be done. He stopped in the middle of the road. On Krypton, he had fought for order because chaos had killed his world. He had believed, with the certainty of a man who had buried everything he loved, that freedom without discipline was simply a slower form of suicide. He had carried that belief across the stars. He had carried it into this atmosphere. He had carried it through every encounter on this strange, loud, gaudy planet. And now, standing in a street full of strangers helping strangers, he felt that belief shift beneath him for the first time in his long life. These people were not Kryptonians. They were not soldiers. They were not the disciplined citizens of a council world. They were chaotic, contradictory, vain, distracted, and absurd. They built false gods. They worshipped images. They sold their dignity for entertainment. And yet, when the gods fell, they did not wait to be told what to do. They simply began, without orders, without leaders, without a hand at the wheel. They picked up the pieces. They tended to the wounded. They swept the glass. They made room for one another in ways no council could have legislated and no decree could have enforced. Zod watched them, and a thought he had never permitted himself to think rose quietly inside him. Perhaps this world did not need a ruler. Perhaps it had been ruled for too long already, and that was the entire problem. He stood in the road for a long time. The sun moved, shadows shifted. Somewhere a siren faded into the distance. He thought of Krypton. He thought of the leaders who had failed it. He thought of himself, the general who had vowed to never let such failure happen again, and he wondered, for the first time, whether his vow had ever truly been about saving worlds, or whether it had simply been about not having to trust them. The wind moved his cape. He looked up at the sky, and he made a decision no conqueror in the history of the stars had ever made before. He did not announce his departure. There was no broadcast, no final sermon. No farewell address carved into the side of a mountain for future generations to find. Zod had never been a man for endings dressed as performances. He left the way he had arrived, quietly, completely, on his own terms. He rose from the plaza at dusk, slowly, the city beneath him still smoking, still bleeding, still beginning the long and uncertain work of becoming something new. He did not look back. He did not need to. He had already memorized this world. He would carry it with him across the dark between stars, the way a soldier carries the memory of a battlefield he chose not to claim. The clouds parted around him as he climbed, the atmosphere thinned, the sky deepened from gold to violet to black, and then, as quietly as a thought, he was gone. Behind him, the world he left was not the world he had found. The seven were finished. The survivors were stripped of their titles, their contracts, their carefully constructed myths. Their faces, once printed on cereal boxes and lunch pails and stadium banners, were quietly removed from shelves, peeled from walls, scrubbed from the public memory by the same machinery that had once enshrined them. Vought, the empire that had sold godhood by the gallon, fractured into 100 smaller companies, each one denying it had ever been part of the original. Lawyers grew rich. Executives vanished. Documentaries were commissioned. And Homelander, the strongest hero the world had ever known, was last seen on a grainy security feed, wandering alone through an abandoned parking lot in the middle of the night, talking to no one, smiling at nothing. A king whose kingdom had finally remembered it had never asked for him. Humanity rebuilt, slowly, without a god to guide it. Cities rose again, this time without faces on their billboards. Children learned new names in their classrooms. Heroes, when they appeared, were quieter, smaller, more careful. The age of manufactured saviors had ended, not with a war, but with a verdict delivered by a stranger from another sky. And in the years that followed, when the world spoke of that strange chapter, it did not speak of conquest. It did not speak of defeat. It spoke of a day when a true ruler had arrived, looked down upon their gods, and judged them unworthy. They spoke of a man who could have taken everything and chose not to. They spoke of the moment they understood, finally, that the figures they had worshipped had never been gods at all, that the capes had been costumes, that the thunder had been marketing, that somewhere beyond their atmosphere real power had walked among them for a handful of days and then walked away. The sky, they realized, had never belonged to their heroes. It had only ever been borrowed. And one quiet evening, a general had come to take it back, and then, in the end, had given it to them instead.